A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon.
He didn't really know exactly why this ridge was here.
History may have just been rewritten. For decades, scientists believed the first humans arrived in North America around 13,000 years ago. But in the empty deserts of Oregon, archaeologists uncovered something terrifyingly impossible. Ancient human footprints, primitive tools, signs of life buried beneath layers of earth untouched for thousands of years. When scientists tested the evidence, the results shocked the entire archaeological world, more than 20,000 years old. That's not just an old settlement, that's a discovery capable of rewriting human history itself. Because if humans were already living in Oregon during the Ice Age, then everything we know about the first Americans could be wrong. Who were these people? How did they survive one of the harshest climates in human existence? And why are some experts desperately trying to challenge the discovery? This isn't just a lost civilization story, this is the moment history broke. And what researchers found next makes the mystery even darker. Subscribe before we begin, because once you see the evidence buried in Oregon, there's no going back. The discovery that shattered a century of archaeological certainty. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists had a story they trusted completely. The story went like this. Around 13,000 years ago, the first humans crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska and slowly pushed south through a narrow corridor that had opened between two massive glaciers covering most of Canada. These people, known as the Clovis culture, were considered the original Americans. If anyone came forward with evidence suggesting humans had arrived earlier, the archaeological community had a standard response ready. They called it contamination or misinterpretation. The timeline, as far as most researchers were concerned, was settled. Then a team from the University of Oregon started digging at a rock shelter in the high desert of eastern Oregon. And the settled timeline began to fall apart one layer at a time. The site was called Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter. Nobody expected it to produce anything controversial. The team had not gone there to rewrite history. Their original goals were modest. They wanted to study Ice Age animal remains and track how the local environment had changed over thousands of years. The Bureau of Land Management archaeologist, who had worked in that district for 21 years, was on site with them. It was routine fieldwork in a quiet, largely overlooked corner of the landscape. Nothing about the site suggested it was about to become one of the most disruptive archaeological finds in American history. What the researchers pulled out of the ground were stone tools and animal bones, unremarkable on their own. But when the lab results came back, everyone went quiet. The tools had blood on them. Blood that old should not exist. It almost never survives. But there it was. When they dated the sediment layer, they used a method called optically stimulated luminescence. What that means in plain terms is this. Certain mineral grains, when buried, stop absorbing light. They essentially freeze in place. Scientists can measure exactly how long those grains have been sitting in darkness, which tells you precisely when that layer of earth was last exposed to the surface. That reading came back at nearly 20,000 years old. And buried inside that layer were stone tools with deliberately sharpened edges and animal bones covered in cut marks. Not the kind left by predators, but the clean, angled strikes of someone methodically stripping meat and pulling hide from a carcass. People were hunting and processing kills at that site 7,000 years before the Clovis model said the first human being ever set foot on this continent. That is not a minor revision. That is the entire foundation of the story cracking open beneath your feet. But the real shock came when archaeologists realized that the ground itself was preserving a perfectly ordered record of human activity stretching far deeper into the past than anyone thought possible. The perfectly preserved layers. When the team started working through the sediment at Rimrock Draw, something immediately stood out. The layers were undisturbed, and if you know anything about archaeological sites, you know how rare that is. Normally, the earth is working against you. Burrowing animals tunnel through the ground and drag objects from one era into another. Tree roots grow downward over centuries and pull material with them as they push deeper. Rainwater seeps in and slowly carries small artifacts sideways, depositing them in layers they were never originally part of. All of this means that by the time archaeologists arrive, objects have been silently moving through the ground for thousands of years. Something abandoned 10,000 years ago could end up resting in a layer that is only 2,000 years old. You can never completely trust that what you uncover truly belongs where you discovered it. But the rimrock draw was unusual. The layers remained flat and perfectly separated from each other. Think about it this way. Every time people stayed in that shelter, they left traces behind: fire ash, charcoal, broken bones, organic remains. Over time, that material compressed into a clear dark band within the sediment. Then, when the shelter was deserted and nobody returned for centuries, nothing new was added, only wind-driven dust and fine desert sand drifting slowly through the open face of the rock shelter, settling in thin layers across everything below it. No human presence, no organic remains, only sediment building up the way it does when a place is entirely abandoned. That process created a pale, clean layer above the dark one. Then people came back and another dark band appeared. Then they left once more. Another pale layer of dust and sand settled over the top. That cycle repeated itself over thousands of years. Dark band, pale layer, dark band, pale layer. Every layer sealed neatly on top of the previous one. As the team excavated deeper, stone tools continued appearing. They were not disturbed or mixed together. They rested separately within their own distinct layers, each one tied to its own moment in time. Things like handheld scrapers used to remove hide from an animal, small sharp blades shaped from flint or obsidian for slicing meat. They were simple objects, but ones that only existed because a person intentionally sat down and created them. One group of tools would appear inside a dark band, surrounded by the ash and bone fragments from that specific period. Then a pale layer of clean sediment above it, representing centuries of emptiness. Then another dark band, and within it another collection of tools from an entirely different era. It was exactly the pattern you would expect to discover if different groups of people had been returning to that same shelter across thousands of years without ever meeting one another. And that is exactly what the evidence suggested. This was not a place where one group stopped briefly, sheltered from a storm, and disappeared. People kept returning here, generation after generation. They knew this place existed, and they understood why it was worth coming back to. The reason became clear once you understood the geography. During the Ice Age, the land around that rock shelter sat beside a wetland. In the middle of a brutal, unforgiving desert, standing water was an extraordinary resource. Animals traveled from across the region to reach it, and the people who knew about that water continued following them there, consistently and repeatedly across thousands of years. But the real breakthrough was still waiting ahead. Deeper in the sediment, the team reached a layer sealed beneath a band of volcanic ash. What was hidden underneath it would become the clearest challenge to the accepted story of when humans first arrived in North America: the giant Ice Age camel. Buried beneath the ground were teeth and jaw fragments belonging to Camelops hesternus, an extinct giant camel that once roamed across North America in massive numbers. This animal stood nearly 7 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed several hundred kilograms, and it had disappeared from the earth thousands of years before anyone thought to search for it here. But the bones themselves were not what unsettled the researchers most. It was the positioning. They were not scattered the way bones scatter when an animal dies alone and decays in an open field. They were arranged in the precise, recognizable pattern that appears at human butchering sites throughout the ancient world. When the team studied them closely, they discovered repeated cut marks concentrated around the joints. That detail matters. The joints are where a person butchering an animal would naturally begin, slicing through connective tissue to separate the limbs and reach the meat. Those marks did not come from animal teeth. They did not come from weathering or the pressure of sediment building up over centuries. They matched exactly the kind of marks left behind by stone tools. Someone had hunted this animal, brought it down, and then stood over the carcass and carefully butchered it. To understand what that means, you have to imagine the world those people were surviving in. Nearly 20,000 years ago, North America looked almost nothing like it does today. Glaciers covered most of Canada, and ice sheets nearly 2 miles thick dominated the northern half of the continent. The open plains were shared by mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and these ancient camels moving in herds across landscapes that no longer exist. Dire wolves hunted in those same regions. Saber-toothed cats did too. The world was colder, stranger, and far more dangerous than anything alive today can truly describe. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a group of human hunters killed a giant camel, dragged it back to that rock shelter, and sliced the meat from its bones using handheld stone tools. Here is where the story becomes harder to ignore. The bones were discovered sealed beneath a layer of volcanic ash traced directly to a known eruption of Mount St. Helens that occurred more than 15,600 years ago. Here is why that matters. When a volcano erupts, ash does not slowly drift down over time. It falls all at once, covers everything beneath it in a single event, and then hardens into a permanent sealed layer over time. When the team found that ash sitting directly above the camel bones, completely untouched with no cracks or disturbance of any kind, it meant one thing. Those bones were already buried before the eruption happened, which means the people who butchered that camel were living in North America more than 15,600 years ago at the absolute minimum. The Clovis first theory says the first humans arrived 13,000 years ago. That is a gap of more than 2,600 years. These were not the first Americans. Someone was already here. The Clovis model had not simply been questioned, it had been contradicted by the Earth itself. Then came the radiocarbon dating of the camel tooth enamel, and the number that returned was approximately 18,250 years before the present day. Sit with that for a moment. What the Oregon site was now suggesting was that humans had been walking, hunting, and processing animals in the Pacific Northwest at least 5,000 years before the Clovis people were supposed to have arrived. That was not a small revision. That was the kind of discovery that forces an entire field of science to pause and rethink everything it believed it understood. Then came the detail that completely changed the tone of the discovery. Among the tools uncovered at Rimrock Draw was a scraper, a small handheld cutting tool shaped from stone. But the stone it was made from was orange agate. That sounds like a small detail until you understand what it means geographically. Orange agate does not exist anywhere near Rimrock Draw. The closest known source is hundreds of miles away. Nobody casually picks up a rock that far from home by accident. That material had to be intentionally carried to that site, which meant one of two things. Either the people using that shelter were traveling enormous distances across an Ice Age landscape that most researchers had assumed was barely navigable, or they were trading and exchanging materials with other groups across a network that stretched hundreds of miles. Either way, these were not isolated, barely surviving wanderers clinging to survival at the edge of the continent. These were people moving through North America with intention and reach. When the tools were studied under magnification, the evidence became harder to dismiss. Tiny fractures lined the edges, the kind that form only after repeated use. They told a clear story. These tools had been used, worn down by real hands performing real work. And here is why that matters directly. The Clovis first theory claims that when the Clovis people arrived, they were working with a very specific and recognizable tool technology, long fluted stone points crafted in a particular way. That was the signature. That was how you identified a Clovis site. But the tools at Rimrock Draw were older than Clovis and made differently, from materials gathered hundreds of miles away, showing wear patterns from extended use. They did not match the Clovis signature. They predated it entirely, which meant the people who made them were not Clovis people. They were someone else, someone who was already here. More importantly, one scraper was not discovered with the camel remains. It was found beneath them. It rested in a deeper layer of earth, one that had remained untouched by whatever activity left the butchered bones above. In archaeology, that detail carries a simple and unavoidable meaning. Deeper layers are older. There is no way to reverse that sequence without disturbing the ground, and nothing in that layer showed signs of disturbance, so the implication stood on its own. If the camel dated back more than 18,250 years, then the tool beneath it had to be older. That was the moment where the discovery crossed into something far more difficult to explain. The evidence was no longer simply suggesting early human presence in the region. It was pushing that presence further back than expected, into a time that challenged accepted timelines. The ground had preserved that sequence perfectly, layer upon layer, each one holding part of the story, each one placing human activity earlier than anyone had been prepared to accept. But even with all of that, there was still a problem. Skepticism does not disappear easily, especially when the claim carries this kind of significance. Stone tools and cut marks could be questioned, debated, reinterpreted. There was always room for doubt, no matter how small. What was needed was something definitive that could not be explained away or dismissed as coincidence. And that discovery came next when the team began protein residue analysis, the microscopic blood evidence. Protein residue analysis depends on what is physically trapped inside the material itself. The idea is simple, but the implications are not. When a stone tool cuts through flesh, tiny amounts of blood and tissue are forced into microscopic fractures along the edge. Those traces do not simply vanish. Under the right conditions, they remain there for thousands of years. That was the hope, at least. If anything had survived inside those tools, it would be buried deep within the stone, protected from the outside environment. But that also meant the process had to be handled with extreme caution. Any modern contamination could ruin the results, or worse, produce false ones. The cleaning process came first, and it was meticulous. Every surface was carefully treated to remove anything that might have settled on the tools in recent times. The goal was to completely strip away the present and leave behind only what had been there since the tools were last used. It took time. It required patience. There was no room for shortcuts. Only after that did the testing begin. At first, there was nothing dramatic about it. Samples were carefully extracted from those tiny fractures where the edges had once touched flesh. The work was quiet and controlled, the kind of process that does not reveal its significance until the results return. And when they did, everything changed. The proteins matched Bison antiquus, an extinct species that once roamed across Ice Age North America in enormous numbers before disappearing thousands of years ago. That identification carried a weight that was difficult to ignore. It meant that the tools had not just been shaped for cutting, they had cut into a real animal, one that no longer exists, one that lived and died in a world far removed from the present. The connection strengthened immediately. The evidence now existed at multiple levels at once. Geological layers established the timeline. Archaeological context placed the tools and bones together. Biological traces confirmed direct contact between tool and animal. Each line of evidence supported the others, and together they left very little room for doubt about the collapse of the Clovis First theory. The collapse of the Clovis First theory. The evidence uncovered at Rimrock Draw pointed to human activity more than 18,000 years ago. That alone was enough to bury the Clovis First theory, but there was a second problem beneath the first one, and it was just as damaging. The Clovis model did not only claim that humans arrived 13,000 years ago, it claimed they arrived through a specific route. The theory argued that the first people crossed from Siberia into Alaska and then moved south through a narrow ice-free corridor that had opened between two massive glaciers covering most of Canada. That corridor was the only proposed pathway into the rest of the continent. The entire model depended on it, but 18,000 years ago that corridor did not exist. The glaciers had not yet retreated far enough to create it. The northern half of the continent was still locked beneath an enormous unbroken sheet of ice stretching thousands of miles. There was no gap, no passage, no route south. The route the Clovis model depended on was physically impossible at the time. The rimrock draw evidence suggested humans were already living in Oregon, and yet the people at Rimrock Draw were there, hunting giant camels in the high desert thousands of years before that corridor ever opened. If people were present that far south at that time, then they did not arrive by the route that had been accepted for so long. The timeline and the landscape simply did not support it. So, another possibility moved forward. It was one that had been considered before but never fully accepted. It is known as the coastal migration model. This theory suggests that the first Americans did not wait for an inland corridor to open. They came by sea, moving south along the Pacific coastline, traveling in small watercraft, staying close to the shore of a continent they had never seen before. That route was not safe. The North Pacific coastline 18,000 years ago was one of the harshest marine environments on Earth. Storm systems that formed across thousands of miles of open ocean reached that coastline with nothing to weaken them. No landmass in their path, no natural barrier to absorb the force. By the time those storms reached the shore, they had gathered full strength, driving waves 30, 40, 50 feet high directly into the rocks. There were no harbors, no shelter, no chance of rescue. If a wave took your boat, you were gone. And yet the evidence suggests that people made that journey anyway, stopping along the way to fish, hunt marine mammals, and gather shellfish from the rocks. Enough food to keep moving, enough skill to survive conditions that would be considered extreme even by modern standards. What that requires is not just courage, it requires accumulated knowledge, an understanding of tides, currents, and weather patterns that could only come from generations of people living and dying by the sea before this journey ever began. These were not wandering groups stumbling blindly across a new continent. They were experienced maritime people who understood the ocean well enough to cross it, and that leads to the most unsettling thought of all. Rimrock Draw may not represent the beginning of this story. It may only be the first place where the evidence has survived clearly enough to be recognized, the deeper layers that could rewrite human history again. At Rimrock Draw, the camel tooth drew attention because of its age and because of the clear signs that humans had butchered the animal. At first, it seemed like a boundary, a point that marked how far back the evidence could safely reach. But that assumption did not last long once the layers beneath it were examined more carefully. The tooth was not resting on bedrock. It was not sitting at the bottom of the story. Beneath it, the earth continued, holding older sediments that had not yet been fully explored. Those deeper layers were not empty. They were already beginning to reveal signs that something had happened there long before the camel ever died. Small stone flakes have been recovered from beneath that level. They are not as obvious as fully shaped tools, but they carry the same suggestion of deliberate action. Stone does not fracture in those patterns without force applied in a controlled way. Alongside them are subtle indicators that are harder to define but difficult to ignore once recognized. Slight disturbances in the soil, patterns that suggest repeated activity rather than random natural processes. The work at the site is far from finished. Researchers have been transparent about that from the beginning. Large portions of Rimrock Draw remain untouched because excavation comes with limits. Funding does not last indefinitely, and every layer removed is a layer that can never be replaced. Preservation matters just as much as discovery, and that balance slows everything down. One expert involved in the work made that uncertainty clear when describing what has not yet been uncovered. The expectation is that larger animals should also appear in those deeper layers, drawn to the same wetland environment that attracted the camel, but those remains have not yet been discovered. Not because they are not there, but because the ground that may contain them has not been opened. That leaves a question hanging in place. If tools or clear signs of human activity are eventually confirmed in those deeper sediments, the timeline does not just shift slightly. It moves in a way that forces a complete reevaluation. The presence of people could extend back to 22,000 years. It could reach 25,000 years. It could go even further into a period that has barely been considered in relation to human movement into the Americas. Some scientists have already started following that line of thought. They are looking toward the last glacial maximum, a time nearly 26,000 years ago when ice sheets covered vast portions of the northern continents and sea levels dropped dramatically. That drop would have exposed more of the Pacific coastline, potentially creating routes that no longer exist in the same form today. If people were present during that period, they may have traveled along those edges, navigating a landscape that has since been altered or submerged. That possibility changes more than a date on a timeline. It changes the entire framework of how early humans are understood to have lived and moved. It suggests that they were adapting to extreme conditions much earlier than expected, using environments that required awareness, planning, and skill. It also means that the earliest traces of their presence may not be where anyone first thought to look. The pattern is changing. The story that once seemed stable is beginning to open, and each new piece of evidence adds pressure to what had stood unquestioned for nearly a century. Rimrock Draw is no longer just a single site with unusual findings. It has become something more unsettling. It has become a fracture in a long-accepted narrative. And somewhere beneath layers of ash, soil, and ancient silence, the true beginning of human life in the Americas may still be waiting to be uncovered.